Picture 9 feet by 6 feet. That's the entire world for a Jagdpanther crew, sealed behind sloped steel with no turret to swing and nowhere to run if the engine catches. But the number that should actually scare you isn't the armor thickness. It's 7. Accounts from surviving crewmen put 7 seconds as roughly the gap between an ammunition rack catching fire and the vehicle turning into what German troops themselves nicknamed a Ronson, because it lit every single time. Start with a basic design problem, because everything else in this story flows from it. A tank has a turret. A tank destroyer doesn't. 0 rotation. Engineers deleted that rotating steel drum to save weight, lower the silhouette, and bolt on a bigger gun than the chassis could otherwise carry. It worked. A Hetzer or a Jagdpanzer IV could kill a Sherman from a range the Sherman couldn't return fire at. But the crew paid for that advantage in square footage. Every cubic foot the turret would have occupied got handed to the gun breech, the ammunition racks, and the transmission housing instead. 4 or 5 men now lived, fought, and slept inside a fixed steel box the size of a small closet, bolted to an engine that ran hot enough to cook eggs on the deck plate. Start with sleep, because it's the thing veterans complained about longest after the war ended. In good weather, on a quiet stretch of front, a crew slept outside the vehicle. Under it, usually. Belly armor as a roof, a canvas tarp staked into the mud on either side. That sounds almost comfortable, until you remember what was directly above their heads. 60 tons of steel resting on a transmission and a set of torsion bars, with nothing stopping the whole vehicle from settling 3 or 4 inches into soft ground overnight. Crews who dug their sleeping trench a little too shallow woke up, if they woke up at all, with a hull sitting on their chest. 60 tons. No warning. When the front got active, or when a crew was ordered to stand ready for a night counterattack, sleep happened inside the vehicle itself, which meant sleep barely happened at all. No bunk anywhere. A loader might curl against the ammunition racks with a jacket for a pillow. The driver stayed wedged behind his tiller bars in case the order came to move at 0300. Men learned to sleep sitting upright, chin on chest, in 15 and 20-minute stretches, the way sailors on a submarine learn to sleep in shifts, because there simply aren't enough bunks to go around. The difference is a submarine has a hot meal rotation and a place to stretch your legs. A Jagdpanther crew had a gun breech 18 inches from their skull and an order that could arrive at any minute. Food followed the same brutal math as everything else, constrained by space that didn't exist and a supply chain that, by 1944, barely existed either. Standard issue was tinned meat, hard biscuit and margarine, supplemented by whatever the crew could scavenge, buy, or, in the desperate final year, simply take from farms along the retreat route. Cooking inside the vehicle was against every safety regulation the manual could write. Crews did it anyway, every time. The engine deck, once the vehicle had been running for 20 minutes, held heat well past what a field stove could manage. Men balanced a mess tin of water or coffee substitute directly on the warm armor plate near the exhaust louvers and let the residual heat do the work. It smelled like diesel and burnt ersatz coffee, and after enough weeks on the line, nobody noticed anymore. Real coffee had mostly disappeared from the German army by the middle of the war. What crews drank instead was a roasted grain substitute, sometimes cut with actual coffee, traded or looted from captured stores, and the flavor was reportedly closer to burnt toast than anything you'd order today. Not exactly a treat. Cigarettes mattered more than the coffee did. Tobacco rationing hit the front lines hard, and a crew that ran out of cigarettes on a static sector could trade almost anything for a fresh pack, including food they were hungry for. One habit that shows up again and again in post-war interviews is crews rolling cigarettes from whatever paper they could find, sometimes newspaper, sometimes the wrapping from a ration tin, because tobacco without paper was tobacco you couldn't smoke. Hygiene collapsed almost as fast as the coffee supply did. A crew that spent 3 or 4 weeks on a static sector without rotating back to a rear area went that entire stretch without a real bath. washing with whatever water they could spare from the canteen and a rag. Lice moved in within days. They never fully left. Veterans describe a nightly ritual of running a lit match along the seams of a uniform shirt, listening for the faint popping sound of eggs cooking off in the fabric. Because it was the only delousing method available, short of a proper bathhouse, the army rarely provided that close to the front. Fresh water for drinking came from wherever it could be found: a village pump, a stream, a shell crater that hadn't been fouled yet, and it was boiled when there was time, and drunk untreated when there wasn't. Which is exactly the kind of decision that put a man in a field hospital with dysentery instead of a bullet wound. Now for the part nobody puts on the recruiting poster. No bathroom, not even a designated corner. A crew sealed inside a moving vehicle during a fight didn't get to ask the enemy for a pause. Men urinated into empty shell casings, sealed them, and passed them out through the pistol port when there was time, or simply held it through hours of combat when there wasn't. Solid waste was worse, and the honest answer from most accounts is that crews simply endured until the vehicle stopped moving and it was safe to climb out, sometimes 6 or 8 hours after the need first hit. Dysentery, when it swept through a unit, turned that math into something closer to torture, and more than one crewman reportedly fought an entire engagement while sick enough to be hospitalized under any other circumstance. The physical environment inside the fighting compartment deserves its own reckoning, because temperature alone could disable a crew faster than enemy fire. In summer, with the engine running and the hatches closed for combat, interior temperatures reportedly climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, well over 100 Fahrenheit. An oven with a gun bolted to it. Men fought fully dressed, helmeted, gloved in that heat, sweating through uniforms that then froze solid the moment the sun went down and the engine shut off. Winter brought the opposite extreme. Some crews called it the crueler one. Steel holds cold the way it holds heat, and a hull that had sat overnight in a Russian winter could sit at well below freezing on the inside, with frost forming on the breech block, and the crew's own breath fogging the periscopes faster than they could wipe them clear. Carbon monoxide deserves its own warning. It killed men who never took a single wound. The engine, mounted at the rear, vented exhaust that could seep forward into the fighting compartment when the wind was wrong or a gasket had failed. And a crew running with hatches sealed for a night movement sometimes never noticed the gas building until someone slumped over the gun sight. Post-war medical accounts from armoured units on both sides describe crews found unconscious and, in the worst cases, dead after a routine road march. No enemy contact, no explosion, just an engine doing exactly what it was built to do in a space that was never built to vent it safely. Accounts collected from surviving members of Panzerjäger battalions on the Eastern Front describe entire crews found dead at their stations after a long approach march, with hatches closed against the cold, engines run continuously for warmth, no enemy fire anywhere near them. The figure most often cited for exhaust-related deaths in armoured units across the war is almost certainly an undercount, because a crew found dead beside an intact vehicle rarely generated the kind of paperwork a combat loss did. Commanders learned, sometimes only after losing a crew, to crack a hatch during any extended halt, no matter how cold the night was, trading a few degrees of warmth for the certainty of breathable air. Getting wounded inside that steel box came with its own grim logistics. No room to move. A man hit by spall, the fragments of the vehicle's own armour knocked loose from the inside by an impact that didn't fully penetrate, could be bleeding badly in a space too cramped for anyone to properly reach him. The loader or gunner nearest the wound applied a field dressing where they sat, often working blind in a smoke-filled compartment. Because pulling a wounded man out through a hatch mid-engagement usually meant exposing the entire crew to whatever had just hit them. Evacuation, when it came, meant strapping a man to the rear deck or laying him across the engine grills, hot metal against an open wound, for however long it took to reach an aid station that might be an hour's drive back through contested roads. But heat, and cold and hunger were survivable in a way the fire wasn't. And every man in that crew knew it, every single minute they sat inside the hull. A tank destroyer carried its main ammunition in racks lining the fighting compartment walls, close enough to touch. And a single penetrating hit into that ammunition didn't produce a fire so much as a detonation. No warning shot, just gone. The vehicles that used wet stowage ammunition racks, water-jacketed to slow ignition, fared somewhat better. The ones that didn't earned the grim nickname crews on both sides used for a tank that had just been killed with everyone still inside. Getting out mattered more than almost anything else the crew trained for, and the drill was brutally simple. Loader first, through the rear hatch if the vehicle had one, gunner and commander next, driver last, because his hatch sat furthest from the ammunition. Crews rehearsed that sequence blind, in the dark, with gloves on, because the 7 seconds the survivors talk about doesn't leave time to think. What kept men functioning through all of it wasn't equipment, it was each other. Nothing else. A tank destroyer crew of 4 or 5 men lived closer to each other than most married couples, ate from the same tin, and depended on each man doing his one job correctly under fire, or everyone died together. Loaders learned to read a commander's tone before he finished a sentence. Drivers learned the sound of their own engine well enough to diagnose a failing bearing before a gauge confirmed it. That closeness produced something crews from both sides described the same way after the war. Losing one man from the crew, even to a wound that wasn't fatal, felt like losing a limb, and replacements were rarely welcomed the same way until they'd proven themselves under fire. Mail was the other lifeline. Field post moved with a reliability that surprised even the men receiving it, given how badly everything else in the supply chain had broken down by the war's final years. A letter from home, sometimes weeks old by the time it reached a moving unit, got read aloud in the fighting compartment during quiet stretches, then read again privately, then carried folded inside a jacket until the paper wore soft at the creases. Crews who lost that connection, whose hometown had been bombed or whose mail simply stopped arriving for reasons nobody explained, reportedly became noticeably harder to command, less willing to take the kind of calculated risk that separated a good crew from a dead one. Maintenance discipline sat underneath everything else, unglamorous and constant, because a tank destroyer that couldn't move or couldn't fire was worth exactly nothing, no matter how brave its crew was. Track tension got checked every morning the vehicle wasn't fighting, no exceptions. The gun's recoil mechanism got wiped down and re-greased on a schedule that didn't care how tired the crew was or how little sleep they'd had. A driver who let engine maintenance slide because he was exhausted wasn't just risking a breakdown, he was risking the 7 seconds every man in that crew had already memorized. Because a vehicle that couldn't reverse out of a bad position was a vehicle waiting to take a hit it couldn't survive. The men who lasted longest on the line, by every account that survives them, were rarely the boldest. They were the ones who treated the boring maintenance checklist like it was the only thing standing between them and the fire. By late 1944 and into 1945, the survival math had gotten worse in every direction at once. Fuel first. Fuel shortages meant vehicles sat parked and exposed for days, waiting on gasoline that never arrived, turning the crew's home into a stationary target. Spare parts had dried up along with the fuel, so a broken track or a cracked road wheel that would have been a 2-hour fix in 1941 could sideline a vehicle for a week, with the crew sleeping in the open beside a machine they couldn't move and couldn't abandon. Replacement crews arriving that late in the war were often teenagers or older reservists with a fraction of the training earlier crews had received, thrown into that steel box with veterans who had months, sometimes years, of survival instinct the new men simply didn't have time to learn. It's worth pausing on how a tank destroyer crew's experience actually differed from a tank crew's, because the two got confused constantly even at the time. A Tiger or Panther crew had a turret they could rotate independent of the hull, which meant the gunner could track a target while the driver kept moving. and it meant the commander had a cupola with a real field of view in every direction. A tank destroyer crew had none of that. No independent traverse, the gun pointed wherever the hull pointed, which meant the driver became a de facto gunner's assistant, constantly nudging the entire vehicle a few degrees left or right to walk the barrel onto a target the turret crews could have swung onto in a second. That single design difference shaped everything about how these crews fought. They favored ambush positions, dug in hull down, with only the low, sloped front visible, because they physically could not afford to get caught traversing in the open the way a turreted tank could. Winter gear told its own story. Improvisation, mostly. Official cold weather issue arrived late and inconsistently, especially on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1941 and 1942, and crews who'd been promised proper insulated coveralls sometimes fought an entire season in standard wool uniforms, layered under whatever they could scrounge. Straw stuffed into boots for insulation, civilian coats taken from abandoned houses and worn under the regulation jacket where an officer wouldn't notice. Newspaper wrapped around the torso under a shirt, which did almost nothing for warmth but became such common practice that veterans still mention it decades later as one of the small, faintly absurd survival tricks nobody back home would have believed. The math on who came home tells its own story, and it's worse than the popular image suggests. Armoured crew casualty rates across the war ran significantly higher than infantry casualty rates in comparable units. Surprising, given the armour. People picture a tank as protection. On the battlefield, it was closer to a target. A crewman who survived his vehicle's destruction and climbed out through smoke and flame with burns on his hands, having lost a friend who didn't make it through the hatch in time, then reported to a replacement depot and did it again in a different vehicle, sometimes within days. That's not a statistic you can flatten into a single number and move past. It's 4 or 5 men, over and over, rebuilding the same closeness with strangers, knowing exactly what the next hit could cost them. So what actually got a crew through months of that? Routine, mostly. Small rebellions against an environment trying to kill them by inches. A driver who kept a photograph wedged behind his instrument panel where only he could see it. A loader who insisted on the same seat every single time because changing it felt like inviting bad luck. A commander who made his crew brew the terrible airsats coffee at the same hour every morning, regardless of what the front looked like. Because a schedule, any schedule, was proof that tomorrow was still something you could plan for. A gunner who talked to the gun itself before a hard engagement, quietly, the way some men talk to an old car that's never once let them down, half joking and half not. Chaplains who reached forward units rarely stayed long, so crews built their own small rituals in place of anything formal. A prayer muttered before buttoning the hatch, a lucky coin passed hand to hand before a dawn advance. Nothing that would survive contact with a rational explanation, but everything that got a man through one more sunrise. None of it changed the odds. All of it made the waiting bearable. And in a steel box with no windows and no room to stand up straight, bearable was sometimes the only thing left to aim for. One question is worth sitting with. We remember tank destroyers as machines, numbers on a spec sheet, kill ratios against Shermans and T-34s. But every one of those machines was also a home, the worst home imaginable, shared by 4 or 5 young men who cooked on the exhaust, slept sitting up, and counted 7 seconds as the difference between a bad day and no more days at all. What would it actually take you to last a single week in that box? Not fighting the enemy outside it, just surviving the one you were sealed inside. If stories like this are the kind of history you want more of, the next one's waiting, and it goes even further inside a machine almost nobody ever sees from the inside.